Hi, my name is Nick Bolu. I am a patent attorney. This presentation is about designing around patents. So most of the time, my job is getting patents for people to help them protect their inventions from copying. And an important concept in that is, the strength of the patent. How difficult is the patent to design around? So this is kind of the flip side of what I normally do. This is showing what needs to be done to design around a patent. So if a patent is easy to design around, then that makes it less strong. And then if it's very difficult to design around, then it makes it more strong. So this is useful for the analysis to, if you practice designing around a patent, this also can help you see the strength of a patent. So I think this is a useful exercise to look at. And so that you know how, a competitor might view designing around your patent. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the elements to prove patent infringement. Then I'm going to give examples of designing around famous patents. I asked ChatGPT to list some famous patents from the past 50 years, and it gave me about 10, and I thought these were 5 of the more well-known patents. So we're going to analyze those patents, and see if we can design around those and what would be needed to design around them. My contact information is on the right here. My LinkedIn information is here. If anyone watching this wants to connect on LinkedIn and stay in touch, please do that. And then my law firm bio page is here, and then my email's there. So these are the elements to prove patent infringement. 1, ownership of a valid patent. 2, identification of patent claims. Most patents, the basic filing fee pays for 3 independent claims and 20 total claims. So a lot of applications will have 20 total claims. And then so you need to identify which patent claims you're looking at. You can have the patent covers all of the claims. 3, claim construction, which is done typically in a Markman hearing. The court interprets meaning and scope of claims based on the patent specification, the prosecution history, expert testimony, and literature, for example, journals, dictionaries. The 4th step is to compare claims to accused product process. Does the accused product or process contain every element or equivalent of at least one claim? So that's kind of the main step that we're going to be talking about in this presentation, is comparing, analyzing the claims to see what the scope of the claims are. And then 5 is evidence of infringement. You look at, so anything to show that the competitor is infringing your claims, product manuals or specifications, reverse engineering analysis, expert testimony, marketing or advertising material, or demonstrations of use are some examples. Okay, so this is the first patent that we're going to be looking at. This is for Apple Macintosh graphical user interface. And this was, important for establishing the Macintosh and a lot of Apple's interfaces. So this patent, I listed the number here, you can look at it. It has 20 claims, and I pulled one of the claims as an example. And this is claim 11 from the patent listed there. And then this is figure 14 from that patent that I thought helped illustrate what was going on in that patent. But this is supposed to be a computer display monitor, and this top horizontal bar is a menu, and I'll have like items T1, T2, T3, T to the N. And under T1, you have cut, paste, insert, tie, save file, then T2, remove display, T3 file. So these are just kind of like a top menu and then sub menus under that. And this invention is, it uses a mouse to select one of these, subjects and select one of the items underneath it. So this was, kind of a groundbreaking patent in 1984. I believe before this, a lot of the computers were running DOS and they weren't very friendly user interfaces. So I'll try to, this is kind of a long claim, which is an interesting point to talk about. First is that to infringe a patent, you need to have equivalence or cover each of the requirements of the claim. So to infringe this patent, you would have to infringe all of this text. So we're going to look at the text, and then I highlighted a couple points that maybe you could design around. So we'll say, okay, in a computer-controlled display system having a display wherein a plurality of command options are displayed along a menu bar, and sub-command items corresponding to each option are displayed once said option has been selected, a method for selecting an option and an item comprising the steps of. So that first part is called the preamble, and basically we have a computer and we have this menu bar, which I kind of talked about before, and then sub-command items. So it's a method of selecting these sub-command items. It says, A, generating and displaying said menu bar comprising said plurality of command options. So it's basically displaying that menu bar on a display screen. B, positioning a cursor on said display using a cursor control device for movement over a surface. The movement of said cursor control device over said surface by a user resulting in a corresponding movement of said cursor on said display. So that's kind of formal claim language, but it's basically saying that you have what I'm doing here with a mouse pointer is I'm using my hand, I'm moving the mouse over a surface, and I'm controlling a cursor. C, signaling said computer of an option choice once said cursor is positioned over first predetermined area on said display corresponding to an option to be selected, said user signaling said computer by placing a switch coupled to said display in a second position while moving said cursor control device said surface such that said surface over said first predetermined area. So that again is kind of some formal claim language, is difficult to read, but it's basically saying you're taking your mouse cursor, you're putting it over one of the menu items, you're kind of maybe pushing down with the mouse and leaving it kind of engaged to select a sub item. D, generating and displaying said subcommand items corresponding to said selected option. So that's kind of showing this cut, paste, insert. E, positioning said cursor over a second predetermined area corresponding to a subcommand item to be selected. Said switch being maintained in second position until said cursor is positioned over said predetermined area. So this is kind of an interesting point. I think it's saying you select one of the top items and then you have to leave the mouse button down and then leave it down until you go to like save or file, and then you can release it to select it. And then F, placing said switch in a first position once said user has positioned said cursor over said predetermined area. I think that's kind of releasing the mouse button, whereby an option and an item associated with option is selected. So that's kind of a lot of claim language, and it's important to remember that to infringe this, you have to, infringe each of these elements. So if you eliminate any of these options or do any of these things differently, then you would not infringe this. So that would be designing around it. So it's looking at this claim language and what can you remove or what can you do differently so that you don't do all of these different steps. And I highlighted a couple areas that I thought would be interesting. So the green, I have cursor control device for movement over a surface. So this patent is from 1984, and I think this is directed to our mouse. So a lot of screens now, especially like phones and tablets, are touch screens. So this patent, if you used a touch screen, you're not moving a cursor over a surface. And even back in these days, they had I remember the Centipede arcade game, and you have like a trackball. And so I think you're just kind of rolling a ball. So I don't even think rolling a ball necessarily would, moving a device over a surface. So, and then also you could have shortcut keys. You could have like Shift F9 or Control F9 or something. And so if you had different ways of selecting this, then you wouldn't do that. So that would be one design around for this patent. The other area that I thought was interesting is kind of what I highlighted in the yellow, where you're talking about the switch. So I think it's saying to, have your mouse switch, like put the left button down, keep it down, and then release it over it. So there's different mouse buttons you could do. So you could just, you don't need to use the mouse button. You could just put the cursor over one of the menu items, leave it hover there for a while. Once it's hovered there for a while, display the items, go down, hover for a while, and then that would select it without doing any of these switchings. Or you could just have single switches without holding anything down. So this is kind of limited in, the kind of, I think a lot of the mouse control that they're requiring here. You could do this in a different way and design around this patent. So I think this was a groundbreaking patent, but you can still see that there's still ways of designing around this. So this would cover doing, these exact things, which is, a very important invention, and it's very valuable to cover this. But if you wanted to do something similar, you could analyze this claim and see, what you could do differently. The next example I have is another Apple patent. This is a Steve Jobs patent for the iPhone multi-touch, the multi-touch screen, which is really important. Before this, you had BlackBerry, and a lot of cell phones had push buttons, and then this is using more of the touch interface for the display without having the buttons. So I'm pulled claim 17 as an example claim. It says, computer readable storage medium having stored therein instructions which, when executed by a device with a touchscreen display, cause the device to detect one or more finger contacts with the touchscreen display. So basically you're touching the display, apply one or more heuristics to the one or more finger contacts to determine a command for the device, process the command wherein the one or more heuristics comprise a vertical screen scrolling heuristic for determining that the one or more finger contacts correspond to a one-dimensional vertical screen scrolling command rather than a two-dimensional screen translation command based on an angle of initial movement of the finger contact with respect to the touch screen display. So this is a picture from the pen, and you have the vertical scroll bar on the right. So this first vertical screen heuristic, this is saying that you have a one-dimensional along the vertical axis. Next, we have a two-dimensional screen translation heuristic for determining that the one or more finger contacts correspond to the two-dimensional screen translation command rather than one-dimensional vertical screen controlling command based on an angle of initial movement of the finger contact with respect to the screen display. So I think that's this other swipe here, and you have the bottom. So you can have a scrolling vertical that's one-dimensional, or you can have a two-dimensional, I think, doing the vertical and the horizontal. And then lastly, a next item heuristic for determining that the one or more finger contacts correspond to command to translation from displaying a respective item in a set of items to displaying a next item in the set of items. So I think that's showing when you have a page of icons, and then if it's a heuristic to determine if you're switching to another page of icons. All right, so again, that's a lot of language. You just have to do one of these, remove one of these, or do it differently, so you're not covering all of these claim steps. I highlighted a few things I thought were interesting. So in yellow, I have finger contacts. So right away, if you were using a stylus instead of finger contacts, this is requiring the finger contact. So if you're doing something other than finger contact, that won't cover this. Again, so I think in the previous example, the mouse had said, maybe a shortcut key like Shift F9, Control F9, Alt F9, something like that. Or you could do like motion, or, not actually having contact. You could have a visual sensor like someone hovering above the screen. So I think all those type of things, would design around this. Similarly, I have in the yellow, it says based on the angle of an initial movement of a finger contact. So that's saying you touch the screen and then you start to move. So it's looking at, which direction, which angle is that initial movement. And I think I've seen some other inventions where, they kind of don't consider the initial movement. They say maybe that's a mistake. A user's moving on a train, their finger gets bumped, and then so it's more reliable to rely on, remove that initial movement and look at the movement after that. So you could do that. So if you remove the initial movement and looked at the secondary movement, then that wouldn't be covered by this patent. And then also I covered in green, I say it's a one-dimensional vertical scrolling and a two-dimensional. So if you change either one of these, then that would help you too. So you could look at two dimensions. You could look at XY scrolling command for determining a vertical, or you could look at a one dimension for, the horizontal, or, make this a one dimensional, or use two dimensional. So there's ways of changing this that you wouldn't be covering, this patent. So again, this is a really valuable patent. This is an important invention, but there are ways you could change this and do it differently so that you wouldn't infringe this patent. Okay, now this is another interesting one. This is from Google. This is one of their key patents that helped establish them as a search leader. So but before Google, there were other search engines like Yahoo and some of those web crawler, different things. I think they looked at a lot of keywords and would give you search results based on keywords. And then Google started this PageRank algorithm that, gave them search dominance. So this is one of those foundational patents from Google. So I'll read that. It says, a computer implemented method of scoring a plurality of linked documents comprising obtaining a plurality of documents, at least some of the documents being linked documents, at least some of the documents being linking documents, and at least some of the documents being both linked documents and linking documents. Each of the linked documents being pointed to by a link in one or more of the linking documents. Assigning a score to each of the linked documents based on scores of the one or more linking documents, and processing the linked documents according to their scores. So on the right here, I have a figure 2 from the patent, and it's kind of showing what it's talking about here. So you can, a lot of the terms in here have to be about being linked or linking or both linking and linked. So I think you can see like this A document, it has this link to this B document. And then it also, this A document is linked by the C document. So you can see that this A document is both linking and linked, and then the C document only links to A, and C is linked by B. So you have these kind of three different documents, and you need these three different types of documents, and you assign scores to them, and based on that, assigning the score, then you process these based on that. So that's kind of an interesting concept that you're looking at these three different types of documents. So right away, it's, if you only looked at one of these, if you only looked at documents that are both linked and linking, then that wouldn't cover this case where you have some that are not doing both, or you could look at one or the other. So that's one way, is just like looking at different data than this. The yellow one, it says assigning a score to each of the linked documents based on scores of one or more of the linking documents. So again, so if you did the scoring in a different way, if you didn't look at both of these, you could just look at page hits, you could just look at linked, or you could just look at linking. If you change this, then you wouldn't be, infringing this and reading on this. So you could change this to design around this. But again, this is a really important patent, and this is valuable technology, but there are different ways of doing this. The next one, this is a Microsoft file system, that was important foundational technology for their operating system. It says, in a computer system having a processor running an operating system and a memory means storing the operating system, a method comprising the computer implemented steps of storing in the memory means a first directory entry for a file wherein the first directory entry holds a short file name for the file, said short file name including at most a maximum number of characters that is permissible by the operating system. So we're saying we have a first directory with a short file name. B, storing in the memory means a second directory entry for the file wherein the second directory entry holds a long file name for the file, and wherein the second directory entry includes an attributes field which may be set to make the second directory entry invisible to the operating system, and the step of storing the second directory entry further comprises the step of setting the attributes field so that the second directory entry is invisible to the operating system. Set long file name, including more than the maximum number of characters, is permissible by the operating system. And C, accessing the first directory entry with the operating system. So again, that's kind of a long technical claim. I highlighted a couple things. The yellow I thought was interesting. It says said long file name, including more than the maximum number of characters that is permissible by the operating system. So right there, this requires that it's more. So you could have just equal to the maximum number, or you could have less than the maximum number. So if you change the length of the file, the long file names, which is calling here, then that would be a design around. This green is talking about attributes for making a file invisible to an operating system. So there's probably different ways. So if you just remove this attributes field and didn't use it so that maybe these files were visible, then that would be a design around. It says you need a specific field, maybe you could have like some kind of different extension or just use different characters, character values instead of a field. So there's different ways of doing this type of technology that won't necessarily infringe this patent. And then my last example is the University of Texas 3D printing patent. So we'll go through this. It says a method of producing a part comprising the steps of depositing a first portion of powder onto a target surface, scanning the aim of a directed energy beam over the target surface, centering a first layer of the first powder portion corresponding to the first cross-sectional region of the part by operating the beam when the aim of the beam is within boundaries defined by said first cross-sectional region, depositing a second portion of powder onto the first centered layer, scanning the aim of a directed energy beam over the first centered layer, centering a second layer of second powder corresponding to a second cross-sectional region of the part by operating the beam when the aim of the beam is within boundaries defined by said second cross-sectional region, including the sub-step of joining the first and second layers during the centering of the second layer and depositing successive powders onto the previous centered layers and centering each successive portion to produce successive centered layer joined to the previous centered layer in a part comprising a plurality of centered layers. Okay, so that's kind of a mouthful also. So I highlighted a few things that I thought were interesting. So this requires 3 layers. So there's a first layer, a second layer, and then it talks about 6 successive layers. So if you were doing something where you're using this technology, but you only had 1 layer, then 1 layer or 2 layers, then that does not read on this because this requires 3 layers. And then in the yellow, I have joining the first and second layers during the centering of the second layer. So that's a very specific way of, combining the second layer to the first layer. So, excuse me, you could, if you separately made the first layer and the second layer, and they weren't connected when you were centering the second layer, for example, if you used an adhesive to connect the first layer and the second layer, or some other, mechanical means that compress them together or something, instead of, centering them together while you're making the second layer, then that wouldn't read on this patent and that would be a design around. So there's a few different ways I think that you could use something similar that would not be covered by this patent. So this is my summary about designing around patents. Practical tips. The scope of a patent is determined by the claim language. So someone says they have a patent for 3D, 3D printing, what does that mean? You have to go look at the patent, look at the claim language and see what that means. It just covers very specific things that are indicated by the claims. It just doesn't cover the concept in general. 2, analyze claim language closely. Again, see what it requires. Think about claim elements you can omit. To infringe the patent, you need to correspond to all the claim elements. So if you could omit one or do something differently, then you wouldn't be infringing it. Think of different ways of performing the same function again so that you don't have to, perform all the claim elements. And again, my contact information is here. Feel free to connect on LinkedIn or otherwise reach out to me. So thank you for watching this video.